The year 1941. The roar of engines fills the battlefields. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, self-propelled guns. The era of steel machines dictates new rules of war. In this mechanized hell, it seemed that the days of cavalry charges were irrevocably a thing of the past. But amidst the roar of engines, the clatter of hooves can also be heard. Cavalry had not yet spoken its last word. Issa Pliev, an Ossetian by origin, managed to achieve the impossible, to transform an outdated branch of service into a formidable force capable of solving the most complex combat missions. When military theorists worldwide were writing off cavalry, Pliev proved its effectiveness in modern warfare. He didn't just preserve cavalry, he revolutionized it, combining centuries-old traditions of horsemanship with the latest achievements in military technology. His cavalry-mechanized groups became a unique phenomenon of World War II, combining the swiftness of a cavalry charge with the firepower of tanks and artillery. The story of Issa Pliev is the story of a man who managed to adapt ancient military art to the realities of the 20th century and thereby inscribe his name in the annals of great commanders. Amidst the majestic mountains of Ossetia, where harsh nature for centuries forged the character of the Highlanders, in 1900, in the village of Old Batakoyurt, a boy was born, destined to become one of the outstanding military leaders of the 20th century. Issa Alexandrovich Pliev came into the world in a simple peasant family, where from his mother's milk he absorbed the ancient traditions of his people. Ossetians, descendants of the Alans, a people with rich warrior traditions, were always renowned as unsurpassed horsemen and fearless warriors. In this culture, where a boy became a man only after learning to stay in the saddle, the character of the future commander was formed. Little Issa spent his childhood among horses, absorbing that special bond between rider and horse, which would later become the foundation of his military genius. In the mountains of the Caucasus, the ability to ride was not just a skill. It was a way of life, a philosophy, a way of thinking. A Highlander, fused with his horse, learned to perceive space differently, to react faster, to think several steps ahead, to use the terrain as an ally. These qualities, instilled in childhood, later transformed into Pliev, the commander's unique tactical signature. Ossetian traditions of raising a warrior man included not only physical training, but also the formation of a special moral code: honor, dignity, faithfulness to one's word, the ability to make quick decisions and bear responsibility for them. These qualities were valued above all in the mountains. Young Issa grew up listening to legends about Nart heroes, epic warriors of Ossetian folklore, whose exploits were celebrated for centuries. These stories shaped his understanding of valor, courage, and military cunning. Particularly strong influence on the boy was exerted by stories about famous Ossetian horsemen who participated in the wars of the Russian Empire. The Caucasian cavalry was always famous for its bravery and skill, and Ossetians occupied a special place within it. Pliev's childhood coincided with a complex historical period: revolutionary upheavals, the Civil War, the formation of a new state. These events did not bypass the mountainous regions of Ossetia. Young Issa observed how the traditional way of life clashed with new ideas, how the world around him changed. This taught him flexibility of thinking, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, qualities that would later manifest in his ability to modernize cavalry to meet the demands of modern warfare. At 17, Pliev made a decisive step that determined his entire future. He joined the ranks of the Red Army. The choice was conscious. The young Ossetian saw in the new army an opportunity to apply his natural talents as a horseman and warrior. A military career opened up prospects for a Highlander that his ancestors could not have dreamed of. But leaving his native mountains, Issa carried with him something more than just riding skills. He carried a special worldview of a Highlander cavalryman, a special view of cavalry tactics, a special sense of space and time. It was this unique combination of traditional culture with modern military education that would later allow him to achieve the impossible, to breathe new life into cavalry in the era of motors and armor. Issa Pliev's path into the cavalry began in 1922, when the young Ossetian entered the Leningrad Cavalry School. In those years, this educational institution was a true forge of command personnel for the cavalry of the young Soviet Republic. Here, two powerful traditions converged: the centuries-old experience of the Russian Cavalry School and the revolutionary spirit of the new army, which sought unconventional approaches to military affairs. For Pliev, this became an ideal environment where his natural talent as a horseman received scientific justification and systematization. The school's instructors, many of whom were officers of the Tsarist army, imparted to the cadets not only the technique of horsemanship and cold steel mastery, but also a deep understanding of cavalry unit tactics. Particularly strong impression on young Pliev was made by lectures on the history of cavalry, where both classic examples of past cavalry battles and the recent experience of the First World and Civil Wars were analyzed. It was here that his understanding was born that cavalry must evolve to maintain its place on the battlefield. Pliev gained his first command experience in 1926, when he was appointed commander of a cavalry platoon. This period became for him a time of practical mastery of the science of managing cavalry units. The young commander proved himself to be a demanding but fair leader, able to find an approach to each soldier. He paid special attention to constant training. Pliev's squadron always stood out for its impeccable training. The young officer's career developed rapidly. By the early 30s, he was already commanding a squadron, and then a regiment. During these years, heated discussions took place in the Red Army about the future of various branches of service. The mechanization of the army was gaining momentum, and many military theorists considered cavalry a relic of the past. However, there were also those who saw in the cavalry a unique tool capable of solving specific tasks even in modern warfare. Pliev was among such visionaries. In 1933, fate brought Pliev together with a man who had a huge influence on his military career, Semyon Mikhailovich Budyonny. The legendary commander of the 1st Cavalry Army, who at that time held high positions in the military hierarchy, recognized an extraordinary talent in the young cavalryman. Under Budyonny's influence, Pliev had the opportunity to continue his military education at the Frunze Military Academy. The academy opened new horizons of military science for Pliev. Here he studied not only cavalry tactics, but also the basics of managing mechanized units, artillery, and engineering troops. He was particularly interested in the issues of interaction between different branches of service. It was within the walls of the academy that Pliev began to form the concept that would later be embodied in his famous cavalry-mechanized groups, formations where the traditional advantages of cavalry were reinforced by the firepower of tanks and motorized infantry. Upon graduation from the academy, Pliev was appointed Chief of Staff of a cavalry regiment, and then regimental commander. This was a time of active rethinking of the role of cavalry in modern warfare. The experience of local conflicts showed that cavalry could be effective in performing reconnaissance tasks, raids behind enemy lines, and operations in rough terrain. Pliev actively participated in the development of new tactical methods, adapting traditional cavalry methods to the realities of modern combat. He paid special attention to increasing the firepower of cavalry units and their interaction with artillery and armored vehicles. In the pre-war years, Pliev continued to improve his skills, mastering new methods of troop command. He participated in large exercises where the interaction of various branches of service was practiced. These maneuvers became an invaluable school for him, allowing him to test theoretical concepts in practice. By the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, Issa Pliev had become a mature commander, possessing both a deep understanding of traditional cavalry art and a vision for the prospects of this branch of service in modern warfare. His readiness for innovation, his ability to combine tradition with innovation, would be the qualities that would allow him to write a bright page in the history of military art. The late 1930s marked a turning point in the history of Soviet cavalry. Military thought worldwide was undergoing a radical transformation. The experience of the Spanish Civil War, Japanese aggression in China, and the lightning campaigns of the Wehrmacht in Europe all indicated that the future belonged to mechanized formations. Tanks, airplanes, and motorized infantry became the main actors on the battlefields, while cavalry, it seemed, was destined to become a thing of the past. During this period, sharp discussions unfolded within the Red Army regarding the fate of cavalry. Some military leaders, relying on the experience of the First World War and the Civil War, advocated for the preservation of large cavalry formations. Others, observing the rapid mechanization of European armies, proposed completely reorienting resources toward the development of armored forces. Issa Pliev adopted a special position in these disputes. He did not deny the significance of the army's technical re-equipment, but also saw the unique opportunities that cavalry retained even in the age of motors. In his reports and speeches, he emphasized that cavalry units possessed unparalleled mobility in off-road conditions, forested and swampy terrain, and mountains, places where machinery proved powerless. In 1938, Pliev was appointed commander of a cavalry division. This appointment gave him the opportunity to put his ideas for modernizing cavalry into practice. Under his leadership, the division became a kind of laboratory for new tactical approaches. Pliev actively introduced elements of interaction with tanks and artillery into the training of cavalrymen, taught soldiers anti-tank combat, and improved methods of reconnaissance and raiding operations. Pliev paid particular attention to increasing the firepower of cavalry units. He sought to saturate the cavalry with automatic weapons, anti-tank rifles, and mortars. At his initiative, the artillery units within the division were strengthened. Pliev understood that in modern warfare, cavalry could only be effective with sufficient fire support. One of Pliev's innovative proposals was the concept of a cavalry landing, where groups of horsemen were transported by trucks to the desired area and then operated as traditional cavalry. This method significantly increased the operational radius of cavalry units. Pre-war exercises demonstrated the effectiveness of many of Pliev's ideas. Experiments on the interaction of cavalry with tank units proved particularly successful. Cavalry covered the flanks of tank wedges, conducted reconnaissance, and developed the success of breakthroughs deep into enemy defenses. A concept was formed that would later embody Pliev's famous cavalry-mechanized groups. Despite the successes of these experiments, there was no consensus within the high military leadership regarding the future of cavalry. In the pre-war years, the number of cavalry formations in the Red Army steadily decreased in favor of mechanized corps. However, the Soviet command did not dare to completely abandon cavalry. The memories of its effectiveness in the conditions of Russian off-road terrain and vast spaces were too fresh. On June 22, 1941, the peaceful life of the Soviet people was shattered by the roar of German bombs and shells. For Issa Pliev, as for millions of Soviet citizens, the most difficult and heroic chapter of life began. At this time, he commanded the 5th Cavalry Division, which, in the first days of the war, entered into an unequal battle with mechanized units of the Wehrmacht on the territory of western Ukraine. The first clashes with the enemy became a harsh test for the Soviet cavalry. German tank wedges, supported by aviation, broke through the defenses of Soviet troops, creating the threat of encirclement. Under these conditions, the cavalry faced serious difficulties. Classic cavalry charges in mounted formation against mechanized units led to heavy losses. Pliev quickly realized that the old methods of conducting mounted combat required a radical overhaul. Unlike many commanders, he did not despair in the face of the enemy's technical superiority. Instead, Pliev began to experiment with new tactical approaches. He divided his division into mobile groups, capable of rapid maneuvering, evading enemy strikes, and launching sudden counterattacks on their flanks and rear. He paid special attention to coordination with artillery and anti-tank weapons. Already in July 1941, Pliev's division participated in the counterstrike near Brody, where the cavalrymen were able to break through to the rear of the German grouping and disrupt its supply lines. This raid showed that even in the conditions of a blitzkrieg, cavalry retained its effectiveness when properly employed. In August-September, during the period of heavy defensive battles, Pliev continued to refine cavalry tactics. He understood that the main advantage of cavalry was not in head-on attacks, but in its ability to move quickly across rough terrain, suddenly appearing where the enemy did not expect a strike. Pliev's cavalrymen learned to operate primarily dismounted, using horses for rapid transfer from one sector to another. By the end of 1941, when Soviet troops launched a counteroffensive near Moscow, Pliev was already commanding a cavalry corps. In the harsh winter conditions, deep snow, and impassable roads, the cavalry showed its best qualities. Horses could move where German tanks and vehicles got stuck. Cavalry units carried out deep outflanking maneuvers around enemy strongholds, cut communications, and sowed panic in the rear. It was during this period that Pliev's concept of the cavalry-mechanized group was finally formed. He became convinced that cavalry was most effective not on its own, but in close cooperation with tanks, artillery, and motorized infantry. Tanks provided firepower and protection, artillery provided support, and cavalry provided maneuverability and the ability to operate in any terrain. By the beginning of 1943, Issa Pliev received an assignment that became a turning point in his military career: to form a special cavalry corps capable of operating in various conditions of modern warfare. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command recognized the value of mobile formations capable of conducting deep raids and developing the success of the main force's breakthrough. Pliev approached this task with particular thoroughness, understanding the historical significance of the moment. He was to create a formation that could prove that cavalry had not yet said its last word. The new corps was based on 2 cavalry divisions with rich combat experience. Pliev personally selected regimental and squadron commanders, preferring officers who combined traditional cavalry skill with an understanding of modern warfare realities. He paid special attention to the selection of political workers capable of maintaining high morale among the soldiers in the most difficult conditions of raids behind enemy lines. The uniqueness of Pliev's corps lay in its structure. In addition to traditional cavalry units, the formation included a tank brigade, a self-propelled artillery regiment, field and anti-aircraft artillery units, and engineering units. It was a true army in miniature, capable of independently solving a wide range of combat tasks. Pliev insisted on including a significant number of anti-tank artillery in the corps, understanding that in modern warfare, cavalry would inevitably encounter enemy armored vehicles. The commander's special pride was the mobile repair workshops, capable of quickly repairing damaged equipment in the field. The integration of armored vehicles into the cavalry corps required Pliev to solve complex organizational tasks. It was necessary to find the optimal ratio of horse and mechanized units, develop methods of their interaction, and establish a control system for this heterogeneous formation. Pliev conducted a series of exercises where various options for joint actions of cavalry and tanks were practiced. Gradually, an effective tactic crystallized. Tanks cleared the way through enemy fortified positions, and cavalry, following them, quickly developed the success, enveloping the flanks and penetrating deep into the defense. Behind enemy lines, horse units could operate independently, dispersing over a wide front and disrupting enemy communications. Pliev paid special attention to communication and control issues. In the conditions of raids behind enemy lines, maintaining stable communication between units became critically important. At the commander's initiative, the corps received reinforced radio equipment and trained signalmen. A special code for transmitting messages was developed, understandable only to the corps' soldiers. Pliev's innovative solution was the creation within the corps of special reconnaissance and sabotage groups operating deep behind enemy lines. These small, mobile detachments, consisting of experienced cavalrymen, collected information about enemy movements, set up ambushes on roads, and destroyed communication lines. Thanks to them, the corps commander always had up-to-date information about the situation ahead of the main forces. Pliev's tactical thinking was ahead of its time. He understood that in modern warfare, it wasn't enough to simply hurl cavalry into an attack. It was necessary to integrate it into a complex system of interaction between various branches of service. His main invention was the concept of the cavalry-mechanized group, where cavalry units operated in close conjunction with tanks, artillery, and motorized infantry. This idea seemed revolutionary, to combine what appeared to be incompatible: the medieval horseman and the 20th century steel machine. However, Pliev saw in this not a contradiction, but a mutual reinforcement of advantages. Tanks provided the breakthrough of fortified positions and firepower, while cavalry offered speed, maneuverability, and the ability to operate in any terrain. Artillery provided the necessary fire support, and aviation covered from the air and conducted reconnaissance. In this complex orchestra, each instrument played its part, creating a harmonious whole. Pliev paid particular attention to the speed characteristics of his corps. In conditions where the pace of an offensive was measured in kilometers per day, his cavalry-mechanized group could advance 30 to 40 kilometers, and in some cases, up to 100 kilometers per day. This allowed for sudden appearances in the enemy's rear, cutting off communications and capturing key objectives before the main forces arrived. Pliev developed a special movement methodology. Cavalry units moved in parallel columns, maintaining constant communication with each other. Tanks and self-propelled artillery followed the most convenient roads, while cavalry used country roads and rough terrain. This organization of the march allowed for control over a vast territory and rapid concentration of forces at the required point. One of Pliev's innovations was the tactic of rolling attacks, where some units engaged in combat while others bypassed enemy strongholds and emerged in their rear. This created the impression for the enemy that they were surrounded by superior forces, often leading to a panicked retreat. Deep raids into the enemy's rear became the hallmark of Pliev's corps. These operations required special training and skill. The corps had to operate autonomously, without constant communication with the main forces and without reliable supply lines. Pliev developed a special system for supporting such raids. Each soldier had a supply of food and ammunition sufficient for several days of combat. The Corps also had mobile repair workshops, field hospitals, and even mobile forges for shoeing horses. All of this allowed them to operate independently of the main forces for up to 2 weeks. Pliev's particular art was his ability to utilize the terrain. His cavalrymen skillfully operated where enemy tanks were powerless, in forests, swamps, mountains. They infiltrated through the front line in small groups, then linked up in the enemy's rear to conduct coordinated strikes. Pliev also understood the importance of interaction with the local population and partisans. His scouts established contact with partisan detachments, who provided valuable information about the enemy and often joined the Corps' operations. This created the effect of the, quote, two of Pliev's cavalrymen, instilling in the Germans a fear of an invisible enemy capable of appearing at any moment and in any place. Pliev's tactical innovations did not go unnoticed by the high command. His methods were studied in headquarters, analyzed by military theorists, and extended to other cavalry formations. Pliev's cavalry-mechanized group became a model for the creation of similar formations on other fronts. His experience proved that even in the age of motors and steel, cavalry could be an effective instrument of war, if commanded by a talented leader capable of combining centuries-old traditions with the demands of modern combat. By early 1943, Soviet forces had launched a large-scale offensive along the entire front. The liberation of Ukraine became one of the priority tasks of the Stavka of the Supreme High Command. It was in these operations that Pliev's cavalry-mechanized group fully revealed its potential. The Ukrainian steppes, with their vast expanses and relatively developed road network, created ideal conditions for mobile warfare. Pliev's corps was tasked with breaking through into the operational depth of the enemy's defenses, cutting off retreat routes for German groupings, and capturing key positions before the main forces arrived. The first serious test was the Donbass offensive in August-September 1943. The Germans had created a powerful defensive line known as the, quote, breaking these fortifications proved to be a formidable challenge for Soviet troops. When the main forces of the front became bogged down in heavy fighting in the main direction, Pliev's corps received orders to execute a flanking maneuver. The cavalrymen and tankmen moved at night, avoiding major roads. The German command, focused on repelling the frontal assault, overlooked the flank threat. Pliev's group suddenly appeared in the rear of the enemy grouping, capturing several key heights and cutting off supply routes. This maneuver forced the Germans to hastily redeploy reserves, weakening their main defensive line. As a result of coordinated actions by Soviet forces, the Quote One was breached, and the liberation of Donbass began. Pliev's tactical signature was particularly evident during the crossing of the Dnieper. While the main forces were preparing to overcome this water barrier in the main directions, the cavalry-mechanized group made a rapid forced march to the river in an area where the Germans did not expect a crossing. Using makeshift means, fishing boats, rafts, logs, the cavalrymen began crossing even before the pontoon units arrived. Advanced detachments captured a small bridgehead on the right bank and held it until the arrival of the main forces. The Corps' tanks and artillery provided fire support from the left bank, suppressing enemy strongpoints. The Germans, discovering the unexpected crossing, launched counterattacking reserve units. But it was too late. The bridgehead expanded by the hour. This operation became a classic example of using the element of surprise and the maneuverability of cavalry. During the Zhytomyr-Berdichev operation in the winter of 1943-1944, Pliev's corps demonstrated an astonishing ability to operate in the most challenging weather conditions. Deep snow, frosts, and impassable roads made the movement of equipment extremely difficult. However, the cavalry maintained mobility even in these conditions. Pliev developed a special tactic for winter operations. The cavalrymen moved across virgin snow, forging paths for the equipment following them. Tanks were used primarily for fire support, not for maneuver. This adaptability allowed the corps to continue its offensive even when other units were forced to halt their advance due to weather conditions. One of the most daring raids by Pliev's corps was the operation to liberate Rivne in January-February 1944. The city was an important administrative center and communications hub. The German command expected to hold it for a long time, relying on its pre-prepared defenses. However, Pliev applied an unconventional approach. Instead of a frontal assault on the city, his corps executed a deep flanking maneuver appearing from the western direction, from where the Germans did not expect an attack. Advanced detachments, operating disguised as retreating German units, infiltrated the city before the main assault began and captured key objectives: the railway station, telegraph, and bridges. When the main forces of the corps approached Rivne, panic already reigned in the city, and organized resistance was paralyzed. The city was liberated with minimal losses and destruction. The summer of 1944. The Soviet command was preparing an operation that was destined to become one of the largest and most successful in World War II. Bagration, the code name for the plan designed to finally break the backbone of the German Army Group Center and liberate Belarus. In this grand military symphony, Issa Pliev's cavalry-mechanized group was assigned a special role, that of a swift, maneuverable blade capable of deep penetration into the enemy's rear. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command set Pliev a task of exceptional complexity. His corps was to break through German defensive lines, bypass fortified strongholds, and, developing the offensive in depth, cut off the enemy's retreat routes. In fact, the success of encircling a large enemy grouping depended on the actions of Pliev's cavalrymen and tankmen. Preparations for the operation were carried out in conditions of strict secrecy. Pliev personally developed the routes for his units, meticulously studying maps of the terrain and intelligence data on the disposition of German troops. He paid particular attention to overcoming water obstacles, rivers and swamps, which the Belarusian land abounded with. It was here that the main advantage of his cavalry was to manifest itself: the ability to operate where technology would bog down. The offensive began on June 23rd. Powerful artillery preparation and airstrikes paved the way for the main forces. As soon as breaches appeared in the enemy's defenses, tank wedges rushed into them, followed by Pliev's cavalrymen. The first days of the operation showed how correct the decision was to include the cavalry-mechanized group in the attacking forces. When tank units got bogged down in swampy terrain, the cavalry continued to advance, bypassing pockets of resistance and infiltrating deep into the German defenses. Pliev masterfully used the element of surprise. His scouts, moving ahead of the main forces, identified weak points in the enemy's formation. Then, with a swift dash, cavalry squadrons, supported by tanks, attacked these areas, creating panic in the German ranks. The tactic of night raids proved particularly effective. When small groups of horsemen penetrated the enemy's positions, disrupted communications, and destroyed headquarters and warehouses. By the end of the third day of the offensive, Pliev's corps had advanced 80 kilometers deep into the enemy's defense, a pace unprecedented even by blitzkrieg standards. The German command, not expecting such a rapid breakthrough, began hastily relocating reserves, but it was already too late. Pliev's cavalrymen cut off the main roads along which the encircled Wehrmacht units could retreat. The culmination of the corps' actions in Operation Bagration was the liberation of the city of Slutsk. Pliev employed his favorite tactic, a deep flanking maneuver followed by an attack from an unexpected direction. While the Germans were preparing to repel an attack from the east, the cavalrymen and tankmen appeared from the southwest, causing confusion in the ranks of the defenders. With a swift dash, advanced detachments seized the bridges across the river, preventing the enemy from destroying them, which ensured the unimpeded advance of the main forces. In 2 weeks of the offensive, Pliev's corps covered more than 300 kilometers, liberating dozens of settlements. His actions contributed to the encirclement and subsequent destruction of a large enemy grouping in the Minsk area. Military historians would later call this operation the Belarusian Cauldron, comparing it in scale and significance to the Battle of Stalingrad. For his skillful command in Operation Bagration, Issa Pliev was awarded the rank of Lieutenant General and the Order of Suvorov First Class. But the main reward for him was the recognition of the effectiveness of his tactical concepts at the highest level. Cavalry-mechanized groups became an important element of Soviet military art. Their experience was studied and applied on other fronts. Issa Pliev's command talent manifested not only in tactical decisions, but also in a special style of leadership. His subordinates noted an amazing combination of demandingness and care that distinguished the general from many other military leaders. Pliev never raised his voice at subordinates, but his calm tone and piercing gaze had a stronger effect than any shout. He possessed the rare gift of remembering the names and faces of hundreds of fighters, recalling their combat merits and personal circumstances, which created a special atmosphere of trust in the units. One of Pliev's key command principles was closeness to his soldiers. Even after becoming a general, he regularly appeared on the front line, sharing with the fighters all the hardships of campaign life. In critical moments of battles, he could be seen in the most dangerous places, which inspired the cavalrymen to feats of bravery. At the same time, Pliev never risked needlessly. His appearance at the front was always dictated by the need to personally assess the situation to make the right decision. Issa Alexandrovich paid special attention to the training of officer personnel. He created a unique system in his corps for training young commanders, where experienced officers passed on to newcomers not only formal knowledge, but also invaluable practical experience that cannot be gleaned from textbooks. Regular debriefings of operations, analysis of mistakes and successes became an integral part of the Corps' life. At the same time, Pliev never humiliated subordinates for their blunders, but helped them learn lessons from them. Pliev's intuition became legendary. His ability to anticipate enemy actions, sense weaknesses in defenses, and choose the optimal moment for an attack was considered almost supernatural by many. However, the general himself explained it simply. You need to think like the enemy, put yourself in his shoes. He meticulously studied the psychology of German commanders, analyzed their typical decisions in various situations, which allowed him to foresee the enemy's reaction to the actions of Soviet troops. Decisiveness was another distinguishing feature of Pliev as a commander. Once given a task, he never wasted time on doubts and hesitations. His staff worked like a well-oiled machine, quickly transforming a general directive from higher command into a concrete action plan with a clear distribution of tasks among units. At the same time, Pliev never overloaded orders with unnecessary details, leaving unit commanders the freedom to show initiative within the overall design. A unique feature of Pliev's command style was his ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Unlike many military leaders, he never clung to the initial plan if the situation demanded its alteration. A plan is a starting point, not a dogma, the general often repeated. This flexibility of thinking allowed him to turn suddenly arising problems into new opportunities, finding unconventional solutions in seemingly hopeless situations. An important element of Pliev's command system was effective reconnaissance. He created special reconnaissance units in his corps, staffed with the best cavalrymen. These small, mobile groups penetrated deep into enemy territory, gathering valuable information about his forces and intentions. Pliev personally set tasks for the scouts and was the first to listen to their reports, which allowed him to receive first-hand information without the distortions inevitable when transmitted through several instances. In the spring of 1945, Issa Pliev's cavalry-mechanized group entered the territory of Europe. For the cavalrymen, accustomed to the boundless expanses of Russia and Ukraine, the European theater of war presented new challenges. Densely populated terrain, a developed road network, many small towns and villages, all this required adapting familiar tactics. Pliev did not break what worked perfectly, but made the necessary adjustments. If in the vastness of the Eastern Front his corps operated on a wide front, covering significant territories, in Europe it was necessary to switch to more concentrated strikes. Cavalry units moved in compact groups, closely interacting with tanks and artillery. A peculiarity of the European theater was the abundance of populated areas, many of which the Germans turned into fortified strongholds of resistance. Here, Pliev applied a new tactic. The cavalry bypassed these strongholds, blocked them with small forces, while the main group continued to advance. This approach allowed maintaining a high pace of offensive and did not give the enemy time to organize new defensive lines. In Hungary and Czechoslovakia, Pliev's corps encountered mountainous terrain, which again required tactical changes. The cavalrymen, many of whom were natives of the Caucasus and Central Asia, felt confident in the mountains. They used mountain trails inaccessible to vehicles, carried out unexpected attacks on German garrisons, and controlled passes and heights. One of the most difficult tasks was forcing the numerous rivers crossing the path of the advancing Soviet troops. Pliev developed a special methodology. Advanced cavalry detachments found the most suitable places for crossing, seized bridgeheads on the opposite bank, and then provided cover for the crossing of the main forces and equipment. In March 1945, Pliev's corps participated in the Bratislava-Brno operation. Cavalrymen and tankmen, with a swift dash, overcame the small Carpathians and reached important industrial centers of Czechoslovakia. The Germans, not expecting the appearance of Soviet troops from this direction, were caught by surprise. Pliev skillfully used the element of surprise. His advanced detachments captured several key bridges over the Morava River, preventing the enemy from destroying them. Battles in urban environments presented particular difficulties. Traditionally, cavalry avoided street fighting, but in the final phase of the war, this was unavoidable. Pliev adapted tactics. Cavalrymen dismounted and acted as ordinary infantry, using their mobility for quick redeployment from one sector to another. Tanks and self-propelled guns provided fire support, suppressing enemy strongholds. The final chord of Pliev's corps' combat path was its participation in the Prague Offensive in May 1945. When an uprising against the German occupiers broke out in the capital of Czechoslovakia, the Soviet command threw the most mobile units to aid the rebels. Pliev's cavalry-mechanized group made a swift, forced march and was one of the first to enter Prague, saving the city from destruction and its inhabitants from massacre. The European stage of the war was the last test for Pliev's cavalry and simultaneously a triumph of his military art. He proved that even in densely populated Europe, with its developed infrastructure and complex terrain, cavalry, combined with armored vehicles, remains an effective tool of modern warfare. The victorious May of 1945 concluded the most terrible war in human history. For Issa Pliev, as for millions of Soviet soldiers, the time for peaceful life had come. However, For the outstanding cavalry commander, the end of hostilities did not mean the end of his military career. On the contrary, his experience and talents proved to be in demand in a new era, the era of nuclear weapons and global confrontation. Pliev's post-war career began with education. Understanding that military art does not stand still, he enrolled in the General Staff Military Academy, where he studied the latest theories of warfare. For a combat general, accustomed to field conditions, returning to a desk was a serious challenge, but Pliev approached his studies with the same responsibility with which he had previously commanded a corps. His diploma thesis was dedicated to the use of mobile formations in modern warfare, a topic he knew not from textbooks, but from his own experience. After graduating from the academy, Pliev was appointed army commander. He faced the most difficult task: to adapt his combat experience to the realities of the Cold War. Cavalry was gradually becoming a thing of the past, giving way to tank and mechanized formations. However, the principles of maneuver warfare, masterfully applied by Pliev during the war years, remained relevant. He actively participated in the development of new tactical techniques for tank troops, incorporating the best elements of cavalry art into them: swiftness, flexibility, the ability to act autonomously detached from the main forces. The 50s became a period of rapid career growth for Pliev. He successively held the positions of Commander of Military District Troops, first Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Ground Forces. In 1962, he was awarded the rank of Army General. But the most serious test in his post-war career was the Caribbean operation. At the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war, Pliev was appointed commander of the group of Soviet forces in Cuba. Under his command were not only conventional troops, but also missile units with nuclear warheads. The responsibility placed on the general's shoulders was colossal. The fate not only of the soldiers entrusted to him, but potentially of all humanity, depended on his decisions. In this critical situation, Pliev's best qualities as a commander were revealed: composure, judiciousness, the ability to act under extreme tension. When American reconnaissance planes began regular flights over the positions of Soviet missiles, many commanders demanded permission to open fire. But Pliev understood that any rash action could provoke an escalation of the conflict. He strictly forbade the use of weapons without a direct order from Moscow, thereby possibly preventing the start of World War III. After returning from Cuba, Pliev continued to serve in high command positions. He made a significant contribution to the modernization of the Soviet armed forces, especially in the development of mobile formations. With his active participation, new models of armored vehicles were developed, and the troop control system was improved. Pliev paid special attention to the preservation and transformation of cavalry traditions in new conditions. He understood that it was not about horses per se, but about the special spirit of cavalry, the spirit of initiative, courage, readiness for unconventional solutions. He sought to instill these qualities in a new generation of officers who no longer knew what a cavalry formation was. Under his leadership, special courses on the history of cavalry and its tactical techniques, adapted to modern conditions, were included in the curricula of military schools. Issa Pliev's legacy is not limited to his combat merits during the Great Patriotic War. In the post-war decades, military theorists worldwide turned to analyzing his unique experience of using cavalry in modern warfare. The tactical developments of the Ossetian general became the subject of detailed study in military academies from Moscow to West Point, and his cavalry-mechanized groups are seen as a model for adapting a traditional branch of service to the requirements of a new era. Modern military historians highlight several key aspects of Pliev's military art that remain relevant in the 21st century. First and foremost is the principle of flexibility and adaptability. In an era when military doctrines often become dogma, Pliev demonstrated an astonishing ability to reconfigure tactics depending on the changing situation. He was never a slave to pre-developed schemes, but approached the solution of each combat task creatively. This principle today forms the basis for the training of elite units in many armies worldwide. American military analysts who studied Pliev's experience in the 1970s particularly noted his ability to create asymmetric threats against the enemy. Using relatively small forces, he achieved strategic effect, forcing the enemy to disperse reserves and lose the initiative. In modern low-intensity conflicts, this approach gains special value. Israeli military theorists, for whom mobility has always been a key factor in survival, carefully studied Pliev's experience of raids into enemy rear areas. His methods of deep penetration and creating chaos in the enemy's command and control system are reflected in the doctrine of special operations of the Israel Defense Forces. Of particular interest to modern researchers is Pliev's developed concept of the cavalry-mechanized group. In essence, he created a prototype of modern multi-domain tactical groups, where different branches of service are united under a single command to solve specific combat tasks. This principle today forms the basis of the organization of most highly mobile formations in leading armies worldwide. British military historian Richard Holmes, in his monograph Maneuver Warfare, From Napoleon to Pliev, notes that the Ossetian general intuitively applied principles that later formed the basis of maneuver warfare theory. His emphasis on the tempo of operations, the disorganization of the enemy's command and control system, and the exploitation of weaknesses in their defenses was decades ahead of its time. The French military school, traditionally paying great attention to the psychological aspects of war, highlights Pliev's ability to create in the enemy a sense of the omnipresence of Soviet cavalry. With small forces operating on a wide front, he created the illusion of large formations being present, which demoralized the enemy and undermined their will to resist. Many modern military strategists seek to reproduce this psychological effect today. Russian military analysts note that Pliev's experience remains relevant for operations in the context of modern, quote, his methods of combining regular operations with partisan actions, his ability to interact with the local population, and to create a multi-layered intelligence system find application in today's local conflicts. Pliev's school of troop command and control also attracts the attention of modern researchers. In an era of information overload, his principle of simplicity and clarity of orders, providing initiative to junior commanders within the overall design, becomes particularly valuable. This is what in modern military terminology is called, quote, an approach actively implemented in NATO and Russian armies. Thus, Issa Pliev's military legacy continues to live not only in historical monographs, but also in the practice of modern armed forces. His main lesson, the ability to combine tradition with innovation without abandoning time-tested principles, but creatively adapting them to new conditions, remains relevant for military leaders of the 21st century. The figure of Issa Pliev has long transcended the boundaries of purely military history, becoming an important cultural symbol for Ossetia and all of Russia. In his native North Ossetia, his name is spoken with special reverence. Here he is not just an outstanding commander, but a national hero, the embodiment of the best qualities of the Ossetian people. Streets and squares named in his honor exist in almost every city of the Republic. But the main memorial center became the equestrian monument to the general in the center of Vladikavkaz. A majestic bronze figure of a horseman on a rearing horse symbolizes not only military valor, but also the inseparable connection of the Ossetian people with the traditions of horsemanship. In the House Museum of Issa Pliev, opened in the capital of North Ossetia, the commander's personal belongings, documents, photographs, and awards are carefully preserved. Of particular interest is the collection of gifts from grateful residents of liberated cities and villages. Simple, sometimes naive souvenirs that the general kept as the most precious relics. Here you can also see his famous Cossack shashka, a weapon that Pliev wore even in the post-war years, emphasizing his connection with cavalry traditions. The literary heritage dedicated to Pliev is extensive and multifaceted. Ossetian writers have created dozens of works about their famous compatriot. A special place among them is occupied by Nafi Jusoides' epic poem, The Rider of Honor, where Pliev's image is intertwined with motifs from the Nart epic, ancient heroic tales of the Ossetian people. In the work, the commander appears as an heir to the legendary Narts, a continuer of their military traditions in the modern era. Cinematography also did not overlook the figure of the outstanding cavalryman. In Eldar Ryazanov's film The Last Attack, shot in the 70s, the image of the main character, a cavalry general, was largely inspired by Pliev's personality, and the documentary film Quote 2, created by Ossetian filmmakers, became an important milestone in preserving the memory of the commander. In modern Russia, Pliev is perceived as a symbol of the continuity of military traditions. His name is borne by the Cadet Corps in Vladikavkaz, where young cadets study not only general education subjects, but also the basics of horsemanship, elements of jigitovka, an art that their famous countrymen mastered perfectly. Annually, equestrian competitions for the Issa Pliev Prize are held here, gathering participants from all over the Caucasus. A special place is occupied by Pliev's image in folklore. Songs, legends, and traditions have been composed about him. In them, real facts of the general's biography are intertwined with fiction, creating a heroic image close to the epic. One such legend tells that Pliev could understand the language of horses and talk to them, and his war horse warned its owner of danger. These folk tales, for all their naivety, reflect the deep connection between the commander's image and the traditional culture of Ossetians, where horse and rider have always been one. The military legacy of Issa Pliev extends far beyond the historical context of the Great Patriotic War. In the modern world, where the nature of conflicts is constantly changing, the tactical innovations of the Ossetian general gain new relevance. The main lesson that modern military theorists draw from Pliev's experience is the art of adaptation. In an era when technology is rapidly developing, the ability to rethink traditional methods of warfare becomes a decisive factor for success. Pliev proved that what matters is not technology itself, but the ability to integrate it into a holistic combat system. His cavalry-mechanized groups became the prototype of modern joint tactical groups, where different branches of service unite to solve specific tasks. This principle is applied today in most local conflicts, where flexibility and mobility are often more important than heavy weaponry. The asymmetric approaches that Pliev used acquire special value in the era of hybrid wars. His methods of deep raids, disruption of enemy command and control systems, and creation of chaos in the enemy's rear are studied in military academies around the world. Even in the age of drones and satellite reconnaissance, the principles of maneuver warfare, which the Ossetian general intuitively applied, do not lose their significance. Pliev's ability to create the illusion of a large force presence in the enemy using relatively small units remains particularly relevant. In modern conflicts, where informational influence plays a key role, this psychological effect becomes a powerful tool. Pliev's command style is also valuable for modern military leaders. In an era when centralized control systems become vulnerable to cyber attacks and electronic warfare, his principle of granting initiative to junior commanders within the framework of a general plan acquires new meaning. This is what is called mission command today, an approach actively implemented in the leading armies of the world. Pliev's legacy teaches us that even in the age of high technology, the human factor remains decisive. His ability to motivate soldiers, to create an atmosphere of trust and mutual support, qualities that cannot be replaced by any technical means. For counterinsurgency specialists, the experience of Pliev's corps interacting with partisans and the local population is of particular interest. In modern conflicts, where the front line is often blurred and hostilities are conducted among the civilian population, these skills become critically important. Pliev proved that a military leader must be not only a tactician, but also a diplomat, a psychologist, an organizer. This versatility is becoming increasingly in demand in the complex world of the 21st century, where military conflicts are rarely resolved by force of arms alone. Issa Pliev was and remains a symbol of military art that does not become obsolete with the advent of new technologies. His main legacy is not specific tactical techniques, but a way of thinking, an ability to see opportunities where others see only limitations. It is this lesson that makes the experience of the last cavalryman of the Great War invaluable for future military leaders.